You're listening to News from the Underground on Resistance Radio, resistradio.com. So, let me start off with the Libyan War, which basically began kicking off back in February. You know, we'd seen the uprisings in Tunisia and in Egypt, and there was some talk of these being contrived revolutions. As I've said a few times, you know, I'm still kind of sitting on the fence with regards to the extent to which those revolutions were contrived. Basically because the Tunisian revolution seemed fairly spontaneous to me, and as I've talked about in the past with regards to Egypt, I still don't quite see why the meddling powers, the Anglo-American Israeli alliance, would want to remove Hosni Mubarak, because he was, you know, kind of a perfect puppet, really, and you know, he had a peace treaty with Israel, so he was kind of a perfect puppet leader for Israel. So there's still a puzzle there as to why they would want him removed. Yeah, but I've no doubt, you know, that there was a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and our host Lee Woodberg did a good show where he talked about the various connections between various US pro-democracy groups and, you know, the youth of Egypt who rose up against Mubarak. So, you know, it's possible. And anyway, when the Libyan conflict started, of course, Jones and InfoWars, you know, came out straight away and said this was definitely the globalists, the evil globalists. And you might remember I actually put a video out where I was, you know, fairly critical of that, because I didn't think there was enough evidence at the time that that was the case. As usual with me, I like to sort of sit back a bit. I don't like to just dive in there straight away with the sort of conspiracy angle, because I think it can backfire, really, because it, you know, there's a sense with Jones, well, you know, very much so, that everything is a conspiracy for Jones, and, you know, not everything is a conspiracy. So I do like to sit back and see how things unfold before I start declaring things totally contrived revolutions. And I think for me, you know, it was clear as the war progressed that if this hadn't been totally engineered by the West, then it was going to be taken full advantage of by the West, and we saw that very clearly with Libya. What started off as a mission to protect civilians, supposedly in the city of Benghazi, who apparently were coming under attack from Gaddafi and his forces, even though, you know, if you were ruling a country and people started trying to foment a violent revolution against you and against your ruling party, I mean, it's not kind of natural that you're going to try and suppress that revolution, isn't it? So that's what Gaddafi did, basically. I mean, I'm not shilling for Gaddafi, not defending Gaddafi. I don't think he's a great guy or anything. I think there have been far worse people around than Gaddafi, but yeah, he's definitely didn't deserve his end, did he? Anyway, so as the war progressed, we saw how this mission creep started to happen. So what started off as a mandate just to protect civilians in Benghazi, that then became a very clear mission to overthrow the regime in Libya, and that then developed into a very targeted mission to get rid of Gaddafi, to take out Gaddafi personally, which is what happened when his convoy was targeted, which broke the UN mandates. This was an illegal war, as I talked about last week. Obama didn't have congressional authority to start this war in Libya, and the UN mandate was very limited, but that didn't matter to the Anglo-American and European allies, the people behind NATO. Very clear that they wanted to get rid of this regime, to get into Libya, which is obviously very important for oil production, oil shipment routes. There are other theories about this gold dinar that Gaddafi was planning on introducing. And for me, basically, they wanted to get rid of Gaddafi because he was a kind of a lone strong man, and we've all seen how the people behind the New World Order deal with these kind of lone strong men. I mean, let's not forget that Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa before this war. I mean, it's been bombed to bits now. Various cities are in ruins, but before this war, Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. It was a socialist paradise, practically. I mean, of course, there were it's been said that there were lots of human rights abuses there, and there's no doubt that there was torture going on, that the Gaddafi regime did torture people who they didn't like, but we've done exactly that. This extraordinary rendition program that the US and Britain carried out, that was all about torture. So morally, there's no real difference between Gaddafi and between our own governments and our own leaders. They've all engaged in torture. And looking back at the recent history of Libya, well, it's just crazy, isn't it? We've all seen the pictures of him shaking hands with Tony Blair, his good mate Blair, also shaking hands with Gordon Brown. The relationship was becoming quite warm in recent years, which made this war on the country even more kind of shocking, really, when you think that the SAS had actually been sent to Libya the very year before the Libyan war this year to help train Gaddafi's own forces, and then a mere 1 year later the British SAS are being sent back to direct the rebels. And of course there's all of the evidence of the arms deals that took place between the Gaddafi regime and various British and US arms companies. It's just a textbook example of what the people behind the New World Order are capable of. 1 decade they'll be friends with a leader. We could take the example of Saddam Hussein back in the 80s, when the West were supporting Hussein, providing him with weapons in their war with Iran. But then, the next decade he becomes the new enemy, when it's no longer convenient to be propping him up, and there's a new enemy to target. I mean, this is how it works, isn't it? Friend 1 decade, enemy the next. The same with Bin Laden, for example, who I'm going to be talking about in a short while. He's very clearly an asset, a CIA asset. Tim Osman. And then suddenly he becomes enemy number 1, the scapegoat, just like Gaddafi. So yeah, it was very clear as the war unfolded that if it hadn't been actively fomented, this revolution, by the West, that they were going to take full advantage of it. And when I started to hear the information about the SAS troops being on the ground, literally from the first few days of this uprising in Benghazi. I believe there was a squad of SAS troops there, along with an MI6 agent on the ground. Quite funny actually, because they actually were arrested by some of the rebels. This SAS squad landed by helicopter in Libya, but at night, I think it was at night, and there were obviously rebels there, didn't know what was going on, so they arrested the team that had just landed on the ground. Obviously they weren't aware of the fact that these guys were coming, which resulted in quite an awkward moment where British ambassador had to sort of make a grovelling phone call to an ambassador in Libya, basically saying, look, these are our guys, you've arrested them, it's all a little bit embarrassing, please can you let them go, they're there to help you. It's quite an amusing incident. So that's really the strongest evidence for me that this was a totally contrived revolution, that the forces were there from the very early days of the conflict. And the SAS, of course, all during this war, were on the ground directing NATO's planes. What we saw in Libya was very much, I think, the kind of textbook example of how wars are going to be fought in the future, where the West no longer sends in ground troops, just to crudely invade a country. But I think what we'll see more of in the future is, these so-called rebel groups being armed and aided by the West, and NATO being used in the air. It's much safer for the West to do that, because they're very unlikely to lose a large number of soldiers, and that's when the domestic populations start to take notice of these illegal, immoral wars, when their own soldiers start to be killed. Especially after Iraq and Afghanistan, in which we did see full-scale ground invasions. We've seen the number of casualties there. But with this new Libya model, less British troops, less American troops get killed. You just get these rebels on the ground taking all the hits, basically. So what a messed up situation in Libya, and especially the end of that war, when Gaddafi was executed in cold blood. I mean, those images were brutal and shocking, weren't they? Whatever you might think of Gaddafi, he certainly didn't deserve to die in the way that he did. I mean, that was absolutely disgraceful, disgusting. And I believe the International Criminal Court are conducting some kind of investigation into the circumstances surrounding his murder, but I'd say there's a fairly high chance that that report is going to be a complete whitewash. No doubt it's going to be a complete whitewash. This investigation is being carried out by the ICC, and these were the very same people who were pushing some of the crudest propaganda during the war. You might remember the ridiculous story about Gaddafi personally sending Viagra or Viagra type drugs to his troops, supposedly to aid them in their campaigns of rape against rebel women. A totally kind of absurd scenario for which there was no evidence presented whatsoever, and which large organisations such as Amnesty International, I believe, basically ridiculed. But the ICC were very much pushing this story about Gaddafi and these Viagra Viagra drugs to help troops rape rebel women, and I did a video, exposing how that was complete nonsense. They were parading this Libyan doctor, on Al Jazeera, I believe, and he was the source of these claims of these rape troops in Libya, and it actually turned out he was very connected to the rebel uprising. He wasn't just some neutral medical practitioner. He was actually very key to the rebel uprising in Benghazi. and that was the source, basically, of these claims. So yes, Libya, I mean, absolutely disgraceful, really. And it is kind of depressing, really, when you speak to people in Britain and they don't really seem to have a very strong opinion about the Libyan conflict. At least the people that I've spoken to don't, anyway, who aren't into this kind of stuff that I'm doing now. They kind of fell for the propaganda, this propaganda about Mad Gaddafi and the fact that he was, an evil, brutal dictator. I think a lot of people just fell for that propaganda and just didn't feel very strongly about, this illegal attack on a sovereign nation in which thousands and thousands of innocent people were murdered. Because that's what it is, murder. Anyway, that's enough about Libya. That was back in February that kicked off. So what a great start to the year that was. Mass slaughter to begin the year with. Not good. So anyway, the next kind of big event for me was the royal wedding on the 29th of April. Of course, the happy couple, William and Kate, and Resistance Radio actually had a very small crew down there, myself included. I'd flown over to England and travelled down to London to meet up with Keelan, Wide Shut UK, and also Red, and we were basically on the streets of London handing out flyers protesting monarchy, protesting the royal wedding, and trying to speak to people. And you probably remember the Charlie Veitch incident, where Charlie Veitch was arrested the day before the royal wedding. I mean, that was another sort of key moment, wasn't it, when he got carted away? Kind of put me on edge a bit. I actually removed my SIM card when I was travelling down on the train to London. I was getting a bit paranoid. I thought, oh my god, what if they are actually monitoring me and they're going to sort of grab me as soon as I set foot off the train? So I'd remove my SIM card in case they were monitoring it, which I think was a little bit overboard, because I hadn't been talking about causing any kind of violent disruption at the royal wedding, which Charlie Veitch had been. So anyway, I met up with Keelan and Red there, and we kind of wandered around, tried to speak to people, hand out these flyers, which basically detailed the cost to the taxpayers of the royal family and of the royal wedding. We had some pretty good flyers printed up, and well, it was all a little bit depressing, really. I mean, we had a good day out, but everybody was out. It was a nice day. They had the day off, and it was party time in London anyway, apart from us three miserable gits going around trying to bring everyone down with our anti-royalist propaganda. But it was an interesting day anyway, and memorable for me as well, because I managed to get on Georgian news, which was rather surreal. There were a couple of news reporters filming the Parliament Square protest camp, where Brian Hoare, of course, used to camp out. Sadly, of course, Brian Hoare passed on this year, so he wasn't there when we were there at the end of April. But we did get to speak to some of the other protesters there. Yeah, and this couple of camera people from Georgia were there. So I sort of handed them a flyer. The woman kind of read it. I think she was a little bit bemused, and she said, "Yeah, we'd like to do an interview." So yeah, I gave them an interview. I don't actually know whether it was broadcast or not, but it was quite fun, all the same. And I basically just went on air and said, I'm opposed to monarchy, full stop. I believe we're all born equal, so why should the royals be have advantages from birth? And yeah, it's just mind-boggling to me how people can fawn over the royal family like they're kind of gods or something. Totally absurd, especially during the economic times that we're under now, where people are suffering, but they still have to pay in their taxes to fund these parasites. That's what they are, parasites. But anyway, that was quite a fun day out. I'm not sure how much of a mark we made in terms of converting people to our viewpoint, but you've got to try, don't you? So we tried. And then straight after the royal wedding, I'd gone back up to Leeds. I was staying at my parents', and I woke up on the 1st of May, switched on the news, and lo and behold, the news that, well, I'd been anticipating it, to be quite honest. I always knew it was going to happen sometime soon. I knew I was going to switch on the TV and hear about Osama bin Laden being killed, or being confirmed dead at the very least. But it was still kind of surreal when it actually happened. You do expect these things, but at the same time you don't expect them. And it was one of those things where it was still a surprise. Yes, Osama bin Laden killed at last. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be ridiculous. And one of the first news stories that I read about this supposed assassination of bin Laden was, of course, that his body had been dumped at sea. And as soon as I read that, I mean, it was like, I don't know, it was just farcical, basically. I couldn't believe it, but I also could believe it, because I've seen plenty of ridiculous things. But it was still, very surreal to see the authorities trying to push this idea that bin Laden had been executed, and then because they didn't want to offend the Muslim world, they decided to whisk away his body immediately and dump it in the sea. I mean, come on. What a ridiculous story. I did a vlog just after that, the very morning that the news came out, and the title of that vlog was "We are living in La La Land," because we really are living in La La Land. If someone comes on the TV, if Barack Obama comes on the TV and states authoritatively, Osama bin Laden has been killed, we got him, we had to bury him at sea so we didn't offend the Muslim world, well, people just believe it. And if you dare to question this absurd story, then you're deemed an insane conspiracy theorist. If you dare to ask for evidence, that bin Laden had been killed, well, you're completely insane. You know, who would ask for evidence? Who would ask for evidence that the most wanted terrorist in the world had actually been killed? Only a madman would do that. You know, I've been expecting this for quite a while. Myself and I think the other hosts at Resistance Radio were pretty much of the mindset that bin Laden had actually been dead for a number of years. If you haven't checked out David Ray Griffin's book, it's only a little book, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive, I can definitely recommend that. Maybe you can find that somewhere on the internet, a transcript of it, because it's a pretty thin book, so if you can try and find it online, that might be the best idea. But basically, Griffin in this book lays out all of the evidence that bin Laden was dead and had been dead for a number of years. I mean, the most credible sources basically kind of suggest that bin Laden died very shortly after 9/11, sometime in December 2001. The evidence suggests that he died and was buried in December 2001. I think there was a report in a Pakistani newspaper about that. That he was buried by I think members of the Taliban were present at the burial, and there was other credible evidence, even on CNN, for example. CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta had basically analysed some of the videos of bin Laden. The one where he's kind of sitting in a camouflage jacket in the mountains, which I believe dated from November or early December 2001, and he's looking very ill in this video. And yeah, Dr. Sanjay Gupta basically said, it looks like he's about to die, because it was widely reported that bin Laden was suffering from a kidney condition, and he actually needed to be on constant dialysis for this kidney condition. And based on that video, the kind of frosting over of the features, and also the fact that it seemed he had a paralysed, I believe it was his left arm. He didn't move his left arm at all during this video, which was suggestive of a stroke, which can often happen if you're suffering from sort of advanced kidney disease, basically. So yes, bin Laden hunted down in Abbottabad and executed. But don't dare ask for evidence, because you're a mad person if you do. And even if bin Laden had been killed in that compound in Abbottabad, there wasn't even much of an outcry about this assassination, was there? We had the stories that he was supposedly armed. That was one of the stories. He was trying to cower behind his wife, apparently, as well. I mean, there were various different stories that came out, but eventually we got to the truth that the person they executed wasn't armed at all. And who knows, whether it was bin Laden. I really don't think it was bin Laden, but we'll never find out who it was. Even the people in Abbottabad were incredibly dubious about this story, because we got this ridiculous video supposedly of bin Laden watching himself on television, this little old man, and we were told that was supposed to be bin Laden. It didn't look anything like him, and even one of his neighbours in Abbottabad said, "No, that's not bin Laden. That's my neighbour." completely ridiculous. The story about the US government or the White House watching the assassination was also changed, wasn't it? Because the original story was that Hillary Clinton and Obama were sort of watching the attack on the compound live, and the story was that they saw the special forces go in there and actually take out bin Laden, which was retracted eventually. That wasn't the case at all. They weren't watching that live. We had that photograph of them all round a table in the White House watching a television, with Hillary Clinton's having her hand over her mouth, looking like she was shocked, which looked like a staged photograph, and must have been, because they weren't watching it live. So whatever they were watching in that picture, it certainly wasn't Osama bin Laden being executed. I think it was a staged picture myself. Anyway guys, I'm just going to take a quick break, and when I come back I'll be talking about a few more of the stories that I found interesting this year. Back in a few minutes, guys. Hey, welcome back to News from the Underground with me, Britt. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight. Appreciate it as always. Hopefully before much longer we can find an alternative venue to Blog Talk Radio. It's not the best really. I'd like to get something a bit better set up. Hopefully we can get that set up soon. Hopefully we can try and get some more people in, get more listeners in, and spread this information as much as possible, basically. So before the break I was talking about the key events for me in 2011. I was talking about the killing of bin Laden, the summary execution of bin Laden, and of course another key member of Al-Qaeda, or supposedly a key member of Al-Qaeda, was also taken out in 2011, and that was Anwar al-Awlaki. I mean, this was particularly interesting because this guy was actually born in the US, so the US government is now just brazenly assassinating its own citizens around the globe. US born. I believe he spent some time in Yemen. His parents were of Yemeni descent, and preached in the US. He apparently had contact with two of the September the 11th hijackers. But strangely enough, just after 9/11, Mr. al-Awlaki was actually invited to dine at the Pentagon, to dine with top brass at the Pentagon. They were very interested in him, seemingly. Yeah, very suspicious. Could this guy have been another in the long line of assets and patsies? I think so. But he was basically, just assassinated, wasn't he, by the US. There was another guy taken out with him as well at the same time. The editor of the I can't remember the name of the magazine now, but the Al-Qaeda magazine was also executed at the same time as al-Awlaki. And there's actually been no evidence presented for their death, so we don't even know whether that's correct. I mean, obviously it would seem likely that if al-Awlaki hadn't been killed, he would have appeared at some point to kind of gloat, and he hasn't done that. But there hasn't been any evidence presented that he was killed in those drone attacks back in September. But this guy, it's alleged, was behind loads of major terror plots. Basically all of the attempted plots over the past few years were directed by al-Awlaki, apparently. The Fort Hood shootings. Apparently he was the mastermind for those, even though there's actually no evidence that he ordered the Fort Hood shootings, and the intelligence services were actually fully aware of the communication that he had with the guy who shot those soldiers at Fort Hood. They were monitoring all of the emails, and they didn't read anything that made them suspicious of either of those two that were communicating, which is just crazy, you know. But of course, al-Awlaki became the scapegoat for the Fort Hood shooting. He was blamed for being the inspiration behind that. Also, the attempted car bombing in Times Square in New York, he was blamed for that. The key one, of course, was the underwear bomber. He was also blamed for that. He was supposedly Abdul Muttalib's mentor and had directed him. And I did actually quite a bit of research into all of this, and there is, I mean, really no credible evidence linking al-Awlaki with any of these people, beyond him being a kind of a spiritual influence over them. I mean, this al-Awlaki was incredibly popular on the internet because he spoke, you know, he obviously spoke English because he spent a lot of time in the US, and his sermons were incredibly popular. I think he had like thousands of videos on YouTube which have since been taken down, you know, in which he spoke out against US imperialism, spoke out against the bombing of his fellow Muslims in various countries around the world. And because he did that, and he was obviously a threat to the plans of the Anglo-American Israeli alliance, well, he had to be taken out. You know, no trial for this guy, just blow him away, just blow him to bits from a Predator drone. Another member of Al-Qaeda taken out. So, can we sleep safe in our beds now? Now Bin Laden's gone, now al-Awlaki's gone? Well, it doesn't seem so, does it, after hearing about the security that's going to be taking place at the London Olympics next year, and the absolutely absurd number of military who are going to be taking part in the Olympics. Well, not taking part, they're not going to be like doing a sprint or anything. They're going to be taking part in security preparations for the Olympics. You know, the fear is still being spread by our governments. I mean, I still feel that the next false flag that's going to happen is probably going to be relating to Iran, because it does seem like Al-Qaeda is being wound down a bit in terms of being the enemy, being the other. I think Al-Qaeda's served its purpose now. You know, we haven't had any major attacks, not any successful attacks since 7/7, and yeah, the leadership's been taken out apparently. So I think Al-Qaeda served its purpose, and it's very clear that the West wants to attack Iran. And that's been another running theme of the year, this warmongering against Iran, another sovereign nation which hasn't attacked another country in, well, I read 200 years, and I read in another place 300 years. You know, but either way, you know, a couple of centuries they've not been aggressive against another nation. But it's very clear that they're the number one target for the West now, and that the West is going to use this nuclear weapon pretext to carry out an attack on Iran. And as I've talked about in recent shows, you know, this is very much part of the Zionist plot. This is very much to protect Israel. This is very much being directed by Zionists. We had the Liam Fox and Adam Werrity affair come to light this year also, which was another big news story. Did a couple of videos about that, where I detailed how these people were basically working with the Mossad and were being funded by Zionist businessmen to agitate for war against Iran. And it's dangerous stuff. Just this week there's been news articles come out, the US throwing its weight around again, saying that they won't tolerate the Strait of Hormuz being closed, like they can lecture the rest of the world what to do, as they always do. And Iran are understandably being belligerent about it. No one likes to be told what to do and ordered about by the US. But this reminded me of the Dick Cheney incident, where Dick Cheney basically said that he wanted to dress up some US ships to make them look like Iranian ships, with US soldiers on them dressed up to look like Iranians, get those boats to attack a US ship in the Strait of Hormuz, and to use this as a pretext for an attack on Iran. And they didn't carry through with that plot at the time, which I believe was back in 2009, but it's definitely a possibility, isn't it? So if we do hear of any incidents like that in the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to be pretty likely it's a false flag. So we'll have to keep our eyes on that. I mean, dangerous times. This year's been mental, and I think we're all aware that next year is just going to be even more mental. We've got the economy, which is pretty much collapsing, isn't it? I mean, it's beyond recovery, especially in the US and in Britain and Europe more widely, with the debt that we've got. There's simply no way out of this debt black hole. The people are being made to pay for the debt through austerity. So, I mean, my forecast for 2011 isn't anything particularly original, but things are going to be getting tougher. I don't think that's going to be an overnight collapse myself. I think things are just going to grind down. Unemployment's going to carry on rising. The austerity measures are going to kick in. The protests, I think, are going to increase as well. We saw the Occupy movement start this year. We saw the rioting as well in London, and this is just a taste of what's to come, basically, isn't it? As Celente says, when the people lose everything, they lose it, and that's what we're going to be seeing in the coming year and years to come. Anyway, folks, coming to the end of the show tonight, I'd like to thank you again for tuning in. If you haven't checked out the website, you can find information about all the shows, all the hosts on there, and that's resistradio.com. resistradio.com. You're listening to News from the Underground on Resistance Radio. resistradio.com.